It's a pleasure to be here. And I just want to start out by appreciating all of you for the amazing work that you're doing. It is hard work. I know that. You're inventing a new way of doing teacher education, and you're plowing, sort of a path that people all around the country are watching. So I just want to appreciate the work and the effort and the creativity that is going into all of that invention that you're engaged in. I also want to say that, I came into teaching as a high school English teacher back on the East Coast, initially in Camden, New Jersey. And I did not get a very full and comprehensive preparation to teach. I came in as an intern. I was taking courses while I was trying to teach, at the same time. Many of us may have had that experience. And one of my passions for the kind of work that we're doing here is that, what I learned, and I think what everyone learns, is that to do the job we want to do for children, we really need strong preparation, well supported, and able to allow us to gain all of that knowledge, skills, and the critically important equity dispositions. I'm going to talk a little bit about how residencies can really leverage student and school success. You've had a wonderful group of speakers and thought partners in this conference up till now, and I hope to build a little bit on what you've already heard. Just to start at the starting point, we know that well-prepared teachers matter greatly, even though policymakers don't always behave as though they do. We have a lot of research that finds that student learning is related to students' strong academic background, quality preparation before entering teaching, certification in the field that they're teaching, experience of greater than 3 years, and in some studies, we know that national board certification also adds on to that value added. And in combination, one study found that these features together predict more of the difference in student learning gains than race and parent education combined. So there's a very fundamental equity agenda here. But of course, as you well know, teachers who have all of these attributes are often inequitably distributed and not available to all students, and especially to those who are furthest from opportunity. But residencies promote equity in many ways. One of the things we now have is some evidence about California residencies. We have a new study coming out from the Learning Policy Institute looking at the CTC's survey data from 2020-21 for the folks applying for a preliminary credential. About 10% identified as a resident, over 1,200 individuals. Pat yourselves on the back for contributing to that growing number. Of these, 60% identified as teachers of color. And we know the value of diversity in the education workforce. And this is one way that people not only come into teaching, but get well supported to teach and have a very high probability of then being able to stay. Residents view their programs highly. More than 90% of residents rated their programs as effective, and most rated them as very effective, highly effective. So again, pat yourselves on the back for the work that is going on there. I'm not sure why my slides are not wanting to advance, but sometimes you have to go back in and reboot a little bit. We also know that residents are getting a lot more hours of clinical practice, and most, 2/3, get more than 600 hours in the classroom of their cooperating teacher, which is even more than student teachers get and way more than folks at other pathways get. We also know that the residents get a lot more support from their cooperating teachers, a lot of feedback. And one of the things we found is that that is highly related to later teaching effectiveness. There's a whole set of studies now that show how important strong clinical support in an extended period of time is for later teaching effectiveness. Residents are also demonstrating across the country in studies, and initially here in California, we're seeing some signs of strong effectiveness. The national studies find learning gains and strong ratings. Several California studies have found residents highly rated by principals, both during and after their residencies. And of course, we find high retention rates are beginning to appear here as they have elsewhere. We found in California's, in WestEd's evaluation, that 91% of residents completed their program, were hired into their district. 88% were teaching 2 years after graduation. This is about 25% higher than other pathways combined. So and that of course has strong effects for students, because levels of churn that have often happened in the period of time when we have high teacher shortages actually have a depressing effect on student achievement. So there are many ways in which residents are disrupting the anatomy of inequality. I think of that anatomy as, in this country, built on the degree of poverty. We have the highest child poverty rates in the industrialized world. We have growing segregation and poverty together in districts. We, in many places, have unequal school resources. We're beginning to correct that now in California, but that over time, historically, has led to an inadequate preparation of educators and unequal distribution of educators, which then, of course, affects the curriculum and the functioning of the school. And one of the things that's important to recognize is that this inequitable distribution of well-prepared teachers does contribute to the kind of pedagogy that is experienced by students in the classroom, fundamental equity concerns. We often will then see poorly organized instruction, not enough scaffolding to respond to student needs. Exclusionary discipline goes alongside not having sufficient preparation. Tracking often is reinforced because it takes more skill to teach heterogeneous courses. Furthermore, when we add the implicit bias that is commonplace in this country, that adds quite often the assumptions that students are incapable, families don't care. It reinforces harsh discriminatory treatment. It activates the stereotype threat that any of us experience if identities that we hold are stigmatized. In society and or in school, and quite often there's a lot of stereotype threat activated and reinforced in schools, and that also, when we feel that we might be seen through the lens of those stigmas and discrimination, suppresses student achievement. So residencies, by giving this stronger preparation, by ensuring that teachers are prepared to be successful and stay, really disrupts that anatomy of inequality. And I want to argue this morning that we should work also to be sure that residencies should leverage a new kind of teaching. I think it was Gloria Latson-Billings who said yesterday that a radical reset is needed in our schools. This is the sort of image of education that we sort of inherited through the factory model era, when kids are sitting one by one in their desks, separated from each other, doing their work in their workbooks, filling in the blanks, getting ready for the multiple choice test. And we know so much more now about how education needs to be a collaborative process in which kids are inquiring, deeply looking at and understanding phenomena with the teacher, supporting them on the side. And we need a vision of teaching that is guiding our work in residencies, that will lead us to the kind of deeper learning and equity that we need. We know that our system needs to respond to the changes in the economy and the society, which are valuing complex skills and where the jobs for routine skills are disappearing rapidly. And the dilemma that we have is that the skills that are the easiest to teach and test are also the easiest ones to digitize, automate, and outsource. That is exponentially growing every single year. Knowledge is also growing exponentially. Between 1999 and 2003, there was more new knowledge created in the world than in the entire history of the world preceding. And what that means is we can't divide up the facts that students should know into the 12 years of schooling and sort of ask them to remember those facts and spit them back. Our students are going to have to work with knowledge that hasn't been discovered yet, using technologies that haven't been invented yet, solving major problems that we haven't been able to solve. And the way in which that sort of changes the nature of what school is about was made really clear to me by the vice president at Google, which is right up the street from me here in Silicon Valley, when they explained that they used to collect the transcripts that we produce from schools, the grade point averages and the test scores and so on, and all kinds of data like that. And they used those to try to predict success at Google. And they found that none of those variables predicted success at Google. What they did find that predicted success was what they ended up calling learning ability. The ability to find resources, work with others, create a solution to a problem, test the solution, and continue to improve their own work with this ability to learn. So part of our challenge is to teach for learning ability, that ability to transfer and apply knowledge, not just to remember it, to analyze and evaluate and integrate things, to take initiative for students to be able to plan and implement their own work, to self-manage and improve. And so the vision for learning has to be forefronted as we're transforming teacher education, as you are doing. Deeper learning rooted in equity really is needed, not only because of the economy, which requires this kind of higher order thinking and problem solving skills, but it's related to every aspect of the racial and economic divide that we experience. Obviously, in this time when democracy is under threat, pursuing and defending democracy requires that critical thinking. And ultimately, as we look at the rapid increase in climate events, conflict events, difficulties in sharing the wealth of the planet with everyone who inhabits it, we really need for the survival of the planet to produce a generation of young people who are skilled in not only critical and creative thinking, but also conflict resolution and caring and compassion. And so that vision really creates a demand for the way in which teachers are prepared that adds to our usual list of skills the ability to teach this more sophisticated thinking, to reach diverse students equitably and productively and forcefully with a greater range of needs, and also to help us redesign schools to meet the demands that we're really encountering. So I wonder, and I hope you'll wonder with me, how we can leverage residencies to support the kind of systemic change that we need. LPI did a report at the beginning of the pandemic called Restarting and Reinventing School, and we outlined a number of areas and gave a lot of examples of schools and programs that are already engaged in this kind of work, of what we need to get to the goals that I just outlined. And reinvention really is needed because the schools that we have were designed in the early 1900s. They were not designed to support relationships, whole child approaches, 21st century skills. They were designed on the factory model with this sort of assembly line, image. The kids get on the assembly line, go to a different teacher who stamps them with lessons each year. And middle and high school, they go to a different teacher every 50 minutes and get stamped with those lessons. They sort of get off, different conveyor belts were designed, frankly, by the eugenicists who had a lot of input into the factory model design to separate out students based explicitly by race and class so that they could go to different parts of the economy and the society. So equitable opportunity of achievement was not built in to the design of our schools. And of course, many wonderful educators have been leaning against this design and trying to transform it. We need to prepare our new teachers, particularly in powerful programs like residencies, so that they can be part of the leadership for restarting and reinventing school, really using the knowledge of human development and learning and effective teaching that we have accumulated over the last century and that we need to have guide the schools for the next. There is a movement in the country and the world to sort of synthesize what we know from the sciences of learning and development that have emerged over recent decades: neuroscience, learning science, developmental science, and it tells us some things that are at odds with how we designed these schools. It tells us that the brain is always developing as a product of relationships and experiences. Even at my age, I'm still, when our neurons fire together, they wire together. We can rewire the brain throughout all of life. So there is no way to say that a person's intelligences are fixed at the beginning of their lives. And the goal of schools is to really design the quality of relationships and experiences that will both develop intelligences and allow students to learn the skills and concepts in the curriculum. We also know that learning is social, emotional, and academic. They are completely connected. That if you feel good about an environment, if it's trusting, if you feel competent in that environment and confident, you will learn at higher rates. If you feel traumatized, stigmatized, distracted, anxious, you will learn less well. So the idea that somehow social and emotional learning is off to the side and we just have to focus on, the drill for academics is completely at odds with how the brain actually functions. And we need to prepare teachers to bring those together. We know that children actively construct knowledge by connecting what they know already to what they're learning. So we have to build on prior knowledge and bring in the cultural context. We know that students' perceptions of their own ability actually influence their learning. So the many, many practices that go on in schools that label students and rank them and sort them actually impede the learning of students who carry and know they carry those ranks and labels. I remember when one of my daughters, now a teacher, in kindergarten, was keenly aware that they were taking tests that were going to sort them into different ability levels and that were going to determine what programs they could be in and what kind of education they would be allowed to experience. So this is not something that's mysterious to students. They perceive the ways in which schools often do these labels and rankings. We also know that trauma and adversity affect learning, and of course now more than ever before, so many of our students are experiencing trauma and mental health challenges. Also true for our teachers and our educators, and for all of us. Building room for those relationships and supports for those relationships is the key for healing. And finally, a child's best performance occurs under conditions of low threat and high support in settings where they're accepted, respected, and enabled. And developing a pedagogy that creates an environment of low threat and high support is probably the number one goal of preparation programs, or should be. And enabling teachers to understand what they can do to ensure that each student is accepted, respected, and enabled, which is a huge task. It's way bigger than the number of words on the page. Is really what's going to make a difference for success. So, we used to think that genes drive who we become. We now know that context is the driver. We used to think that talent is scarce, and we should, identify a small number of people for gifted and talented or advanced placement or honors courses. We now know that talent is plentiful and it does not fall on a bell curve. We used to think that average stands for the individual and you could teach to the average or the middle of the class. We now know that average rarely represents an individual. No two brains are alike, and there's a lot that teachers need to know about how their students are learning in order to meet and connect the curriculum to those needs. We used to think the factory model would allow us to educate students, and you can still see the remnants of this in the pacing guides and the standardized expectations for the way in which people will learn. We now know that people both learn at individual paces and ways, and that agency and engagement support their learning. And we used to think that potential is knowable in advance, and you could actually decide on a child's pathway and future early in life. We now know that potential is visible in environments that are designed to reveal it. And so developing those environments in which potential will be revealed is another way of framing the vision for teaching. One of the lessons of this is that schools need to be places where there is much less production of cortisol, which is the hormone that floods the brain when we're anxious, scared, the fight or flight syndrome, when we experience, any kind of anxiety or trauma, which clouds the brain, shuts down the ability to think and concentrate, and also impedes the development of brain architecture. And schools need to be places where there's much more opportunity for the production of oxytocin, what I think of as the hugging hormone, whether it's virtual or physical, which floods the brain with chemicals that actually allow it to grow more brain architecture and think and create and understand much more clearly. And so one of the things that a number of organizations have been working on is, what does that look like? What are the principles for whole child design in schools? And all of these things, with lots and lots of examples of how this can be done and is being done in schools, are available through these design principles, which you can find if you're interested on the Learning Policy Institute website. We've also been developing principles with teacher educators around the country for educator preparation that will allow teachers to be able to create positive developmental relationships, environments filled with safety and belonging, those rich learning experiences, and knowledge development, the development of skills, habits, and mindsets, social, emotional skills, habits, and mindsets like growth mindsets, and integrated support systems. And I'll just mention that some of this is going to require some new structures and practices in schools that allow for positive, trusting relationships over time. In middle and high schools, it requires the development of things like advisory systems, and other places where relationships can be developed, where kids can learn those social emotional skills. It benefits from practices like looping, where kids stay with the same teacher over time. And of course, it benefits from the capacity to build those community systems in classrooms. There's a whole pedagogy that you're well aware of that's really needed for deeper learning, but I'll simply flag that in addition to building on prior knowledge and creating those rich and relevant tasks that are part of project-based learning, that we also need teachers to be explicitly prepared to reduce stereotype threat, to understand that kids will come to the classroom having already adopted and experienced the stigma of stereotype threat, and knowing that they have to proactively work to be sure that students have experiences of affirmation, experiences of competence, recognition of competence, and then very, very important, the development of a pedagogy in which we get the best quality learning, which is that occurs through feedback, revision, reflection, and revision. When we adopt a pedagogy of revision, where kids are getting constructive feedback all the time, we're using rubrics, they're getting feedback from themselves, their peers, and their teacher, and they have the opportunity to redo. You see equity gaps dramatically reduce, because the kids who've had less experience with whatever the concept is before have the opportunity to learn in the way that humans learn best, which is by trying something, getting feedback, having the opportunity to revise and continue to practice and redo. Everybody gets better, equity gaps reduce, but that does mean thinking differently about how we organize our work in classrooms and learning how to do that. Also learning how to support and develop the intrapersonal awareness and the interpersonal skills and the sense of resilience and perseverance that students need to be able both to work well together, but also to be successful in life. And then schools need, of course, those integrated supports that enable that. When we think about preparation of teachers, this means that educators need a learner pedagogy as well as a content pedagogy. They need to deeply understand child and adolescent development as development and learning occur in cultural contexts. And they need to develop that cultural competence, including the capacity to engage productively with families and communities. They need that wide repertoire of skills for scaffolding, the strategies for learning to learn. And we need to think about how the knowledge of learners, of subject matter, of teaching is reinforced by the skills that allow them to be inquirers, to reflect, to diagnose what's going on, to observe, to listen, to question, to analyze, so that they're always able to improve their practice with others, to collaborate, to develop that sense of efficacy, the commitment to equity, and the ability to see where that commitment is needed, and the empathy that will create those settings that we've talked about. And there's some wonderful work that we're happy to share with anyone who's interested around the development of social emotional capacities, empathy, cultural competence for teachers that demonstrates what a big effect that has on the outcomes for learners. As you know, and as your work demonstrates, teacher learning happens the same way that student learning happens, with the hands-on experiences that you create in the residency, within the modeling and the mentoring and the feedback that teachers are getting, and in the communities of practice. And so I want to close by just suggesting that one of the things that some of the residencies have already begun to do, and others are thinking about doing, is building relationships with whole schools, with professional teaching schools. Just as in medicine, we built the teaching hospital. And now in the world, every single doctor in the world goes through a teaching hospital as part of their preparation to become a doctor. That's a pretty new innovation that just started within the last century. It was not always that way. But what is the most powerful kind of learning is the experience in courses and in schools that's reinforcing. And here's a dilemma, right? It's a chicken and an egg dilemma. We don't have a lot of schools yet that instantiate deeper learning and equity, that actually have that kind of practice going on that we know optimally supports children's growth, development, and success, that closes opportunity gaps and closes equity gaps. So in some cases, we really have to help create those. We have to partner with schools. In my experience in the Stanford Teacher Education Program, we actually help create some new schools, as well as partnering with others to help them develop the capacity to be a model of practice, if you will, a place that really took seriously and was able to implement the deeper learning strategies that are needed in this century and the equitable practices because if we don't train teachers in settings like that, their journey to be able to do, to really effect all of the changes they want to effect, and for our systems to be able ultimately to overcome that anatomy of inequality will be much, much more difficult and take a much longer time to accomplish. So what we've found in places that do this kind of work with schools is that it is a joint relationship where the university is working with school folks around the development of practice. One of the things we learned when we were doing this work, in my experience, is that what universities have is credits, and we could offer professional learning for free of all kinds, while we're also inviting teachers from the whole school, not just the cooperating teachers, but teachers from the whole school in to the opportunities that could be afforded through the district, through the university, for ongoing development and reform and improvement. Meanwhile, teacher educators learning from educators in the schools who also know a great deal that often teacher educators in the universities may not have encountered or know or experienced themselves about what good practice looks like. Capturing that practice, researching it, using it for new curriculum development, learning on both sides from the experts in the schools, experts in the universities, and creating that state-of-the-art education for students. There is growing recognition of how this is really the place where the leverage can strongly occur and transform the opportunities for teachers as well as for the students they teach. I want to stop at this point and just sort of suggest that you are really a part of some important goals for 21st century teacher education. We're all in your debt for developing the systems in which we can get past that old saying that those who can do and those who can't teach, and say those who can do and those who understand teach, and those who can teach and those who can't go into a less significant line of work. That is certainly our goal in California, and you are really helping us lead the way. Thank you.